The quiet ones kill you. That's what Dr. Mercer would say later, standing in the administrator's office with his lawyer, not understanding that Margaret Walsh had been killing him slowly for exactly 2 years with nothing but a pen and meticulous handwriting. He didn't see the scars on her forearms when she adjusted for lines. He didn't see the muscle memory that made her hand steady during codes when residents' hands shook like autumn leaves. He didn't see the legend. None of them did. But the numbers didn't lie. The numbers were about to speak. Margaret Walsh clocked in at 5:02 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, the fluorescent lights of Cedar Creek Medical washing out the color of her scrubs the moment she passed through the staff entrance. The corridor smelled like antiseptic and floor wax, that particular hospital smell that lives in your clothes for hours after you leave. Her badge hung from a lanyard with a photo taken 2 years ago, same expression, same neutral distance, same woman who didn't exist before she walked through these doors. The locker in the nurse's station was hers. Compartment 47. She opened it and there was her lunch bag, a thermos of black coffee, and underneath, folded into a perfect square no larger than a greeting card, the flag. She didn't touch it. She never touched it at the start of shift. Just confirmed it was there. Just breathed. The ICU smelled different than the rest of the hospital. Sharper. More concentrated. Machines hummed in frequencies that most people's brains learn to ignore around hour 2 but never completely filtered out. Margaret moved through the pre-dawn darkness of the unit with a kind of efficiency that looked like slowness to people who didn't understand efficiency. Her first patient was Mrs. Chen in for a post-op cardiac catheterization, vital stable, drainage minimal. Margaret reviewed the overnight notes from the night shift, sloppy documentation, times estimated rather than precise, a note about normal heart sounds that could have been written by someone listening to anything. She adjusted the flow rate down by 0.3 milliliters per hour based on the trending fluid balance and recorded the exact time, 5:52 a.m. New documentation. New chart entry. Everything numbered. Everything time-stamped. Room for B was darker. The patient lay on his back with his eyes closed, facial lacerations healing into thin pink lines across his left cheekbone and jaw. Sedation protocol had him at a Glasgow coma scale of 9, reduced from 11 yesterday per neurologist's orders. The monitor beside his bed showed a heart rate of 58 and regular, blood pressure 118/72, oxygen saturation 97% on a 2-liter nasal cannula. Margaret didn't look at the name on the chart. She never looked at the name on the chart. She looked at the patient. She looked at the steady rise and fall of his chest. She looked at the way his right hand lay on the blanket with calluses on the knuckles that came from holding weapons, not from holding anything civilian, and recognition moved through her like current through water. The eyes closed beneath the sedation were the same color as they'd been in a video call from Kandahar 2 years ago when her son had said, "Captain Graves says hello, Mom. He says to tell you thanks for the care packages." The same eyes. The same hands. The same man who was supposed to be dead in a firefight outside Sanjin Valley according to the black site briefing Margaret had attended in a windowless room at Walter Reed before she took this assignment. Instead he was lying in a hospital bed in Raleigh, North Carolina under a false name, and Margaret's job was to watch him heal without acknowledging that she recognized him. She wrote down the vitals in real time. 5:59 a.m. Heart rate 58. Blood pressure 118/72. O2 sat 97. Respiratory rate 14. Temperature 37.2 Celsius. Sedation level stable. Pain control adequate. Bilateral lung sounds clear. Cardiac monitor showing normal sinus rhythm without ectopy. Drainage from left thoracostomy tube 40 milliliters over 8 hours, serous, no evidence of hemothorax. She noted the medications infusing, propofol at 30 micrograms per kilogram per minute, fentanyl 50 micrograms per hour, ceftriaxone 1 gram for every 12 hours, enoxaparin 40 milligrams subcutaneous daily for DVT prophylaxis. Every number. Every decimal. Every lot number from the pharmacy database. She wrote the way soldiers spoke, nothing extraneous, everything essential, no ambiguity possible. The cardiac wing documentation was different than the ICU notes. Margaret rotated through both units, a choice she'd made deliberately during her hiring interview because the hiring manager had mentioned in passing that the cardiac wing had some staffing gaps and irregular documentation patterns. Margaret had taken the position because of those gaps. The Pentagon placement specialist had assured her that Cedar Creek Medical's cardiac wing was where the irregularities lived. Billing discrepancies. Phantom procedures. Inflated equipment charges. Someone at this hospital was running a scheme that fed money into accounts Margaret had never seen but knew existed, the way you know a shark is in the water before you see the fin. She accessed the billing database from her login at the ICU nurses' station. The system was designed for nurses to check insurance coverage and procedure codes, not to audit financial transactions, but the financial transactions lived inside the procedure codes like parasites in clean water. Margaret's eyes moved across the screen with the kind of systematic precision that came from reading intelligence briefings in Baghdad, from parsing satellite imagery in a forward operating base, from being trained by people whose job was to see what other people missed. Yesterday's cardiac wing procedures. 3 coronary angiograms logged. She pulled the medical records. The 3 patients were in the system. But only 2 of them had cardiac catheterization notes in their charts. One patient had a log entry for a complex intervention with drug-eluting stent placement, but her actual catheterization report showed a simple diagnostic study with no stent deployment. Equipment charges attached to her record for $47,000 in interventional materials and technical support. Margaret's hand stayed steady. Steady hands were part of the uniform now, part of the persona. Steady hands meant you'd held worse things than a pen with shaking fingers. She documented what she'd seen in her personal file with a note, discrepancy noted between procedure code billing and actual catheterization report for patient ID 4472. The equipment charges may reflect phantom intervention. Recommend audit review. She dated it. She timestamped it. She did what nurses did when they found problems in the system. She reported it. Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway of the nurses' station at 6:14 a.m. Margaret didn't look up. She was entering vital signs into the electronic health record system, her fingers moving across the keyboard with a kind of mechanical precision that came from 10,000 hours of documentation. The chief of surgery moved through the ICU like he owned it, which he essentially did. Cedar Creek Medical's cardiac surgery program was his kingdom. 3 research papers published in the last 2 years. A cardiovascular fellowship named after his family because his father had donated $2.3 million to the hospital foundation in 1997. Mercer had that specific kind of authority that came from being born into privilege and making sure everyone could see his shoes were too expensive for the salary he officially earned. He stopped at Margaret's computer. He didn't ask. He just leaned down and looked at the screen. His eyes traveled across her documentation, the vital signs, the timestamps, the pharmaceutical lot numbers, the ordered precision of her entries. "You're very detailed," he said, and his voice was like a tank idling in a garage, low and threatening and taking up all the available space. Margaret kept her hands on the keyboard. "It's important," she said. Her voice was soft. Her voice was always soft. "The chart is a legal document." Mercer smiled. It wasn't a smile that reached his eyes. "The chart is a business document," he said. "Don't confuse the two." He straightened. He walked away. But Margaret felt the temperature in the room change, the way the air pressure shifted when something dangerous recognized something dangerous. The rest of her shift proceeded like clockwork. She checked patients. She documented vitals. She changed 4 bags and monitored drips and helped a resident understand why a post-op patient's output measurements needed to be recorded in milliliters, not a lot or not much. At 2:14 p.m., she returned to the cardiac wing billing database to cross-reference patient ID 4472B against a second set of equipment charges from the interventional suite. 3 separate line items for equipment that had no corresponding documentation in the actual procedure note. The numbers added up to $127,000. The procedure had never happened. The equipment had never been used. But someone had billed for it anyway, and Margaret's meticulous documentation had been trained into her like muscle memory, the kind you could never unlearn even if you wanted to stop seeing what was right in front of you. She documented the second discrepancy. She logged the third. By the time her shift ended at 2:53 p.m., Margaret had identified 5 phantom procedures spanning the last 3 weeks, all billing anomalies connected to the cardiac wing, all procedures that existed in the billing system but nowhere else in the medical record. 5. She typed each one into her personal file. Patient names. Dates. Billing codes. Equipment charges. Every number precise. Every entry timestamped. Every detail the kind of evidence that would interest an auditor, if an auditor ever looked at the nursing documentation the way Margaret had been trained to look at classified intelligence reports. She stopped at her locker on the way out. The flag was still there. Still folded. Still carrying the weight of a person who had died 7,894 kilometers away and made Margaret promise to find something worth living for after the mission ended. She picked up her jacket. She left Cedar Creek Medical at 3:02 p.m. on a Tuesday in March. She didn't know yet that Dr. Mercer was in his office, reading through her chart notes from the morning shift, the one she'd scrupulously completed with timestamps and lot numbers and precise details. She didn't know that he'd made a phone call at 3:15 p.m. to someone in the hospital's billing department. She didn't know that the machinery was already moving, quiet and efficient, designed to solve a problem. But that wasn't the worst part. The amphitheater at Cedar Creek Medical filled with the hum of 30 resident physicians settling into their seats, the overhead projector casting a pale rectangle of light across the tiered rows. Thursday morning, 8:36 a.m. Grand rounds. Margaret stood at the back, her hand steady at her sides, watching Dr. Mercer arrange the first slide, her own chart notes, magnified across the screen for the entire room to dissect. The fluorescent lights hummed their institutional song above her head. This, Mercer announced, his voice carrying the precision of someone accustomed to an audience hanging on every word, is what happens when we allow civilian-level incompetence to contaminate our documentation standards. He gestured at the projection with the casual certainty of a man who had never been questioned in his own theater. Nurse Walsh has flagged equipment charges in the cardiac wing with her enthusiastic notations. Perhaps she believes she's conducting an audit rather than providing care. Laughter rippled through the residents like wind across water. Controlled. Predictable. Orchestrated. Margaret's breath came steady and even, the way it had come in a forward operating base at 0300 hours when the alarm woke the compound. One measured inhale. She felt the single tear escape her left eye, not from fear, but from the crystalline clarity of understanding that Dr. Mercer had just announced his hand. He was afraid of her documentation. Afraid of the precision that had already flagged $127,000 in phantom cardiac procedures, in equipment charges that never existed, in kickback accounts that fed directly into accounts carrying his name. She wiped the tear away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact with Mercer. Her gaze remained level and flat, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Around her, the residents shifted slightly, sensing something had shifted in the room's pressure. "My documentation follows VA hospital protocols," Dr. Margaret said, her voice steady as stone. "The same protocols that kept soldiers alive in Kandahar." She spoke as though mentioning the weather. Matter of fact. Clinical. The green of Kandahar's dawn, that was in her voice somehow, in the way she didn't apologize, didn't excuse, didn't diminish. The amphitheater fell silent. 28 residents suddenly found their notepads very interesting. Mercer's smile turned cold, a calculation made and filed away. "This isn't a war zone, Nurse Walsh. It's a hospital. Learn the difference." He clicked to the next slide, but the authority in his voice had cracked just slightly, and Margaret heard it. She heard the thing beneath the dismissal, the fear that his perfect leverage had just shattered. 3 hours later, at 12:15 p.m., the break room smelled of burnt coffee and the particular staleness of microwaved leftovers. Margaret stood at the vending machine, her blue scrub slightly wrinkled from the morning shift, feeding dollar bills into the slot with the mechanical precision she brought to everything. Two residents, Patterson and Chen, stood near the refrigerator, voices pitched just loud enough to carry, just quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability about whether they intended to be heard. "Can you believe Mercer called her civilian level?" Patterson's smirk was visible even in profile. "That's generous. I'd call it mall nurse level." Chen laughed, the sound like breaking glass. She probably got her license from a community college correspondence course. Margaret pressed the button. Seat 7. Black coffee, no sugar, because she'd learned long ago that sugar clouds reaction time. The machine hummed and dispensed her cup into the retrieval slot. She reached for it. Dr. Mercer entered the break room at precisely that moment, too convenient to be coincidence, too staged to be accident. He moved toward the vending machine with the confidence of a man conducting a planned operation. His shoulder caught Margaret's cup with the kind of force that looked accidental but landed with mathematical precision. The coffee arced across the break room floor, liquid spattering in a brown constellation across the tile. "Oh, Nurse Walsh," Mercer said, his voice dripping with theatrical concern. "Perhaps you need a security escort if you can't follow basic protocols like holding a cup." Chen laughed openly. Patterson's eyes gleamed. Margaret knelt to clean the spill, her movements economical and unhurried. She pulled paper towels from the dispenser and began wiping the floor with the same meticulous attention she brought to every task. Muscle memory took over, the same way her hands knew how to find a femoral artery in the dark, or identify a collapsed lung from a single breath sound, or hold a dying soldier's face so he wouldn't feel alone. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice, when it came, was barely louder than the hum of the refrigerator. "My son's commanding officer is in your ICU, doctor." Margaret remained kneeling, her eyes on the spreading brown stain she was wiping away. The green beret in 4B. And I wonder what he'd think of protocols that bill for procedures that never happened. The room froze. Patterson's smirk vanished. Chen's laugh died mid-breath. The refrigerator compressor hummed into a cycle, the only sound in the suddenly crystallized silence of the break room. Margaret rose smoothly to her feet, dropping the spent paper towels into the trash with the same care she'd wiped the floor. She met Mercer's eyes directly for the first time since she'd spoken. What she saw there made her breath deepen by exactly one fraction, not from fear but from recognition. His eyes had narrowed into something darker than embarrassment. Darker than anger. What lived in those eyes was calculation. Assessment. The precise moment when a man understood that the nurse in front of him was not who he had assumed, and worse, that she had been watching him the entire time. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Perhaps, Nurse Walsh, you should focus on your own scope of practice." "Yes, doctor," she said. The deferential words came out steady and even, but they were lies now, and they both knew it. Everything was lies now. The fear was gone from the break room like morning fog burning away. What remained was something else entirely, the weight of one person watching another person finally understand that they had made a mistake. A serious mistake. Mercer turned away, but not before Margaret saw the calculation continuing behind his eyes. He was already strategizing. Already planning. His hand flexed once at his side, and she recognized that gesture. It was the moment a cornered animal decides between flight and fight. She returned to the vending machine and inserted another dollar bill with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. Seat 7 again. Another coffee, because she understood with crystalline certainty that the next few days would require clarity. The machine hummed and dispensed. She retrieved her cup. Behind her, the break room had already begun to shift back into its normal patterns. Patterson and Chen suddenly very interested in a posted memo about hand hygiene, Mercer's presence already dissolving back into the hospital's ambient noise. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't what made Margaret's breath catch once, barely perceptibly, as she walked out of the break room and back toward the cardiac wing. The worst part was knowing that Mercer now understood she was dangerous, and that a cornered man with institutional power and nothing left to lose was the most dangerous variable in any equation. She had just given him a reason to accelerate whatever he was planning. And she had made it clear enough that he knew she knew about the phantom procedures, which meant he would have to move quickly, because a precision-minded person with access to billing records and the backing of the Department of Defense was not someone you allowed to keep documentation. 3 days later, everything would begin to collapse. But for now, Margaret walked back to her station with her coffee cooling in her hands, and she thought about the flag folded in a plastic sleeve in the back of her locker, the flag from her teammate who died in Kandahar, the one whose dying words had been about this very mission, this very identity, this very moment when truth would have to step out of the shadows and change everything. She took a sip of her coffee. It was bitter and cold. She drank it anyway. 3 days passed like held breath. Cedar Creek Medical hummed through its ordinary rotations, code blues and discharged patients, shift changes, and fluorescent light burning down on everything. Margaret moved through it all with the same precise documentation, the same careful notes, the same invisible presence she'd perfected over 2 years. She didn't speak to Mercer. Mercer didn't acknowledge her. The residents had stopped smirking, which meant they'd been told to. The vending machine in the break room still dispensed coffee to anyone patient enough to wait. Then the call came through dispatch at 4:06 p.m. on a Wednesday. Multi-vehicle collision on I-40 eastbound. 2 miles from Cedar Creek. For vehicles. Possible entrapment. EMS en route with 14 minutes to first arrival. The ER erupted in that controlled chaos that trauma teams know by muscle memory, bay doors thrown wide, monitors powered up, crash carts positioned, blood products pulled from refrigeration. Nurses moved like a school of fish, each one knowing exactly where the others would be, every movement purposeful and economical. Margaret was already in her position at Trauma Bay 3 when the first ambulance screamed into the dock bay, its siren cutting through the late afternoon like a blade. The stretcher came through the doors fast. Teenage girl, maybe 16, maybe 17, pale as hospital walls. Blunt force trauma to the chest. The paramedic was already calling vitals into the attending, pediatric patient, severe tachycardia, BP dropping, O2 sat 84, possible pneumothorax, possible hemothorax, we've got 2 minutes to the hospital, got her now. The girl's eyes were open but glass empty, her mouth working soundlessly, her small hands gripping the stretcher rails as if she could anchor herself to this moment, to this breath, to the next one. The trauma attending was Dr. Hollis, good hands, sharp decision-maker, but he was still assessing as the stretcher hit the bay. The X-ray tech was 3 minutes out. The trauma surgeons were still in clinic. 14 minutes away. The girl's O2 sat dropped to 78 in the time it took them to transfer her to the ED monitor, and her heart rate was climbing toward the red line like something trying to escape a sinking ship. Margaret stood at the edge of the bay, watching the girl's chest move in increasingly shallow arcs. Watching the monitor display numbers that meant minutes. Watching Dr. Hollis make the decision to call for the trauma team, knowing they wouldn't arrive in time. Watching the girl's eyes start to glaze. The cardiac monitor beeped once. Twice. Then flatlined into the terrible silence of a rhythm that stops meaning anything. She's coding, someone said, as if anyone in the room hadn't already seen it. As if anyone needed to hear it confirmed. Dr. Hollis was already doing compressions, his hands moving with the automatic rhythm of CPR, pushing hard on a teenage ribcage that shouldn't have to break to survive this. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. Again. Again. The girl's oxygen sat crawled lower, 65 now, 58, dropping like a stone. The trauma team wouldn't get here in time. There was no time. There was only this moment and the next one, both of them already burning away. Margaret moved. The decision happened before the thought, the way decisions do when someone has spent a decade and a half in places where thinking costs lives. I need a thoracotomy kit. Now, she said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Dr. Hollis didn't stop compressions. Trauma teams en route. For minutes. She doesn't have for minutes. Margaret was already pulling on a fresh pair of gloves, the latex snapping against her wrists like a starting gun. Her O2 sat is 49. She's in cardiac tamponade. The pressure's collapsing her heart. Compressions alone won't save her. That procedure requires, Hollis stopped, his hand still moving, his eyes still on the monitor. A thoracotomy kit. Yes. Or a knife. The resident, young man, maybe 3 years out of medical school, hands shaking like aspen leaves in wind, stared at her. We don't, the trauma surgeons. Your pocket knife, Margaret said. Not a question. His hands shook as he pulled it from his scrub pocket. A small blade, stainless steel, meant for cutting tape or opening packages, not for opening chests. It was all they had. He handed it over, and his fingers trembled as they left her palm. Margaret didn't tremor. Her hands had done this before in a converted schoolhouse in Kandahar with mortar fire echoing off the walls and nothing in the supply closet but gauze and hope and the knowledge that the man bleeding on the table in front of her had 3 kids in Helmand Province waiting for him to come home. Her hands remembered. Her fingers remembered. Her entire body was already somewhere else, somewhere older, somewhere where this was survival and not crime. She made the incision. Left anterior lateral thoracotomy just below the 5th intercostal space, and the blade slid through skin and muscle and membrane with almost no resistance, as if her body had been waiting for this moment for 2 years, counting days in the break room and documentation and carefully assembled silence. Blood welled up, too much blood, bright red and serious, the kind of bleeding that meant time was running out in decimal points, and she didn't hesitate, didn't think, just widened the incision and felt her way through the ribs with her other hand, found the space between them, made the space wider. The chest cavity opened like a terrible mouth. She could see the heart now, pale and trembling and wrapped in its own blood like something drowning. Pericardial tamponade. Fluid pressure collapsing the chambers. She reached in, gloved fingers, steady as surgical lasers, moving with the knowledge of hands that had already learned this in blood and darkness, and felt the warm slick of the pericardium, found the point where she needed to be, and pressed the blade in with the kind of precision that takes years to build. Blood spilled. The pericardium released. Pressure fled like a held breath. She placed her hand directly on the girl's heart and began to compress. Her palm against the ventricle. Her fingers curving around the atrium. Manual massage, the oldest technique, the one that works when machines can't. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. Release. Each compression a heartbeat she was making, a rhythm she was forcing back into being. The monitor came to life. 1 beep. 2 beeps. A rhythm. Irregular and fast and furious, but a rhythm. The girl's O2 sat climbed, 54, 62, 71, higher, reaching toward something resembling acceptable. Her blood pressure appeared on the monitor like a miracle. 84/56. 47. 58. Still low, still precarious, but present. Alive. Margaret kept her hand on the heart and looked up at Dr. Hollis. Get her to OR. Now. Hollis moved like he'd been released from stasis. Trauma surgeons were called with a single word. The stretcher was rolling before Margaret had finished suturing the thoracotomy with absorbable thread pulled from someone's kit, her stitches neat and perfect even with a teenager's life under her hands, even with blood soaking through her scrubs to her skin, even with every eye in the bay fixed on her like she'd just split the sky open. The girl was gone to surgery 5 minutes later. Stable. Breathing. Still unconscious but alive, and that was the only thing that mattered. Margaret stepped back from the bay and walked to the scrub sink. She washed her hands. The blood spiraled down the drain in hypnotic red swirls, water running warm and then hot, then hotter, and she didn't stop scrubbing until her forearms were pale again and the water ran clear. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like fluorescent lights always do, indifferent to everything that had just happened. Dr. Mercer appeared in the ER doorway at 5:11 p.m. She saw him in the mirror's reflection, his face arranged in an expression of professional concern, but his eyes already bright with something else. Calculation. Opportunity. The kind of look a man gets when he's just been handed exactly what he needed. He spoke quietly to Dr. Hollis. He gestured toward Margaret while appearing not to. He took notes in a small leather book. Then he made 3 phone calls from the hallway, each one brief, each one ending with a nod from whoever picked up. By 5:18 p.m., Linda Chen from the break room, the only other nurse who'd been standing in Trauma Bay 3, who'd witnessed every detail, was being reassigned to night shift effective immediately. By 5:35 p.m., someone altered the surgical logs to remove the time stamps from the procedure Margaret had just performed. By 5:53 p.m., Dr. Mercer called the hospital's malpractice insurer personally from his office, his voice the model of concerned professionalism, describing an unauthorized surgical procedure performed by unlicensed personnel, an emergency thoracotomy performed by a nurse without proper credentials or attending supervision, a potential liability that could cost the hospital millions. By 6:16 p.m., Margaret's badge stopped working at every door in Cedar Creek Medical. She didn't realize it until she tried to enter the locker room. The card reader gave a soft beep of rejection. She tried again. Same beep. Same red light. A message was appearing on her phone, automatic HR notification, termination of employment, effective immediately, badge access revoked as of 6 p.m. hours, security will escort you from the premises if necessary. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she couldn't defend herself without revealing exactly who she was, exactly what she'd been doing here for 2 years, exactly what would happen to the green beret in room 4B if her cover collapsed and his identity became compromised. The worst part was that by saving a girl's life, she'd just ended her own. The reassignment notice appeared in the hospital system at 4:08 p.m. Margaret saw it pop up on the scheduling portal while she was still in the trauma bay finishing her paperwork from the thoracotomy, the procedure that had just saved a girl's life and ended hers. Night shift, effective immediately. Cardiac wing to pediatric ICU, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., rotating weekends. The kind of shift that guaranteed she'd never see the green beret again, never monitor his vitals, never catch the subtle signs of infection or complication that her training had been calibrated to detect. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a gutting. By 5:15 p.m., Dr. Mercer had already called someone in medical records. Margaret learned this later, the details spilling out from a resident who'd witnessed the conversation through a cracked office door, a Mercer's voice low and methodical, the voice of a man making a call that needed to look routine. Pull the surgical logs from Trauma Bay 2. The teenager, multi-vehicle collision, around 1,400 hours. I need the timestamps removed. Standardize the entry to emergency thoracostomy, authorization pending. Make it look like standard protocol review. The resident had kept walking, pretending not to hear. Everyone kept walking. At 5:43 p.m., Mercer made another call. This one from his office, door closed, but his voice carried through the corridor like a foghorn with a medical degree. He was speaking to someone at the hospital's malpractice insurance carrier. Margaret didn't hear the conversation directly, but by 6:53 p.m., word had circulated through the nursing staff like contaminated blood through a line, a complaint had been filed. Unauthorized procedure. Exceeded scope of practice. Potential patient endangerment. The complaint listed the field thoracotomy by name, questioned her credentials, suggested that her civilian background had led to reckless decision-making despite the girl's stabilization and the surgical team's arrival confirmation that the procedure had absolutely saved her life. The email arrived at 7:14 p.m., while Margaret was in her car in the parking lot, sitting with her hands still damp from the third wash, the soap not quite cutting through the memory of chest cavity beneath her fingertips, the feeling of ribs spreading, blood, so much blood, and the girl's oxygen saturation climbing, 68, 71, 76, 82, 89. Sinus rhythm. The subject line read, immediate administrative leave, pending investigation. The message was 3 paragraphs. Human Resources regretted to inform her that her employment at Cedar Creek Medical was suspended effective immediately pending a full investigation into the unauthorized medical procedure documented in her shift notes. Her security badge was deactivated as of 7:01 p.m. She was instructed to return it to the Human Resources Office during business hours. She should expect to be contacted within 5 business days regarding the formal investigation timeline. In the interim, she was not permitted to enter the hospital, contact patients, or discuss the incident with staff. Not one word about the girl's vitals. Not one word about the fact that the girl was breathing, that her parents were standing outside the pediatric trauma unit right now, holding each other and thanking a God they hadn't spoken to in years. Just unauthorized, pending investigation. Margaret sat in the parking lot for 43 minutes with her hands gripping the steering wheel. The sun had dropped behind the tree line. The fluorescent lights of the ER entrance cast everything in a shade of white that made the world look lifeless. A nurse she recognized, one of the residents from the break room, the ones who'd smirked when Mercer knocked her coffee, passed by the car window. The resident didn't look over. Nobody looked over. She drove home with the radio off and the windows down, letting the October wind scour her face until it burned. On the passenger seat sat the folded flag, the one she'd kept in her locker since being assigned to Cedar Creek Medical. It was small, maybe 6 inches when folded into that careful military rectangle, but it weighed like an anchor. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen. Kandahar Province, 7 years ago, a compound raid that should have gone sideways and would have, except for the Afghan informant who'd warned them about the IED positions, who'd lost his entire family for that information, who was now sleeping 2 rooms down from the pediatric ICU under a name that wasn't his, breathing because Margaret had documented his recovery with the precision of someone trained to notice when a man was being hunted. She couldn't defend herself. That was the architecture of the trap, elegant, suffocating. If she explained that the field thoracotomy was trained procedure, they would ask for her credentials. If she presented her credentials, the military connection would ping. If the military connection pinged, someone would start asking what a captain in the Army Medical Corps was doing working as a civilian nurse in Raleigh. If someone asked that question, the whole operation would collapse like a house built on foundations of classified paperwork and false identities. The informant in 4B would be exposed. The safe house would be compromised. The people who'd hidden him, who'd been bleeding money and resources to keep him alive, would be burned. 12 years of field intelligence would evaporate. And Marcus Chen's dying wish would be broken. She'd held his hand in that field hospital in Helmand Province while the morphine pulled him under, his grip still strong even as the shrapnel wound was pulling him apart. "Promise me," he'd whispered, voice like sand through broken glass, "you'll finish it." The informant. "You get him home safe." She'd promised. She'd been 28 years old, and she'd held the hand of a man she'd known since officer candidate school and promised to spend the next decade of her life protecting someone she'd never met, in a hospital in a country that wasn't her own, in a job that paid $57,000 a year. The defense she could mount, if she were anyone else, would destroy everything. She arrived home at 2:22 p.m. the next day after calling in sick, which meant she'd actually gone home, sat on the bathroom floor, and stared at the white tile for 4 hours before the shaking stopped. For hours of her hands moving independently of her brain, reaching for things, a glass of water, the counter edge, the bathroom door frame, like she was learning how to control her own skeleton. Her son came home from school at 3:15 p.m. He always came home at 3:15 p.m. on Tuesdays and Thursdays when his after-school program didn't meet. 14 years old, tennis shoes that were too small in the toe, a backpack that hung from one shoulder because he thought it made him look casual. He had his father's dark eyes and his father's way of walking, like the world owed him nothing but he was going to navigate it anyway. He found her at the kitchen table with the termination letter printed out and creased from being folded and unfolded. She'd read it maybe 20 times, searching for the words that would give her an out, a loophole, a single thread to pull. There were none. Just, pending, unauthorized, scope of practice, investigation. His backpack slid from his shoulder to the floor. The zipper was broken on one side. It had been broken for 3 weeks, and she kept meaning to take it to the tailor, and every day it stayed broken because she was working doubles, because she was monitoring a patient with a classified identity, because she was waiting for the 6-month assignment to end so she could go back to being just a nurse. "Mom." His voice shifted. The way it always did when he understood something was wrong. Not sick wrong. Something else wrong. Why are you home? She couldn't tell him about the mission. She couldn't tell him about the green beret in 4B or the informant whose real name he'd never know or the fact that his mother's security clearance was currently pinging Pentagon databases. She couldn't tell him that by saving a girl's life yesterday, she'd made herself a threat to a man with power and contacts. She couldn't tell him that the career she'd spent his entire life building had just been incinerated by a doctor who saw her documentation as a noose around his own neck. She could only look at him and see his father's eyes, the eyes that closed for the last time in a field hospital in Helmand Province while she held his hand and promised things she couldn't keep. "I made a mistake at work," she said. Her voice came out wrong. It came out small. A serious one. He sat down across from her without being asked. 14 years old and already knowing how to navigate adult failure. What kind of mistake? The kind that costs everything. He didn't move. Didn't ask for details. Just reached across the table and put his hand on top of hers. His palm was warm, still carrying the sun from wherever he'd been between the school and the bus stop. "Mom, you're the best nurse in that hospital. I've heard you tell people about what you do. How careful you are. How you catch things other people miss." She couldn't explain that being careful wasn't enough. That precision documentation could be used as a weapon. That doing the right thing in a hospital full of people doing the wrong things meant you were the one who ended up destroyed. The room went so quiet she could hear the refrigerator humming, the distant sound of a car on the street outside, the mechanical whisper of the kitchen fan moving air that felt thicker than it should be. Her phone sat on the counter. She wasn't supposed to have her hospital credentials anymore, but she could still access the patient portal with her personal login. She could still see that the girl from the trauma bay, Emma Kessler, 14 years old, same age as her son, was now in the pediatric floor listed as critical but stable. Chest tube in place. Oxygen saturation 96%. The thoracotomy had worked. The unauthorized, scope-exceeding, dangerous civilian-level procedure had saved a life, and now that life would get to go home, get to ask prom dates, get to stand in a kitchen someday and tell her own child that everything was going to be okay. But Margaret would lose her badge. She would lose her position. She would lose the cover that had been keeping one of the most important intelligence assets in Central Command safe. And the green beret in 4B, the man she'd been watching for 8 weeks, monitoring for signs of external threat, documenting in notes that would stand up to federal scrutiny because she'd been trained to document in a way that the military understood, he would be transferred to someone else. Someone who didn't know his real name. Someone who didn't understand that he'd saved an entire unit by giving up his family, his country, his face. That wasn't the worst part, though. The worst part was that she couldn't defend herself without destroying everything. The worst part was understanding, with the clarity that only comes after 12 years of living in the spaces between truth and cover, that sometimes protecting people meant sacrificing yourself completely. The worst part was that her son was looking at her with his father's eyes, and she had no words for him that weren't lies. The termination letter sat on the table between them like evidence of a crime she would never be able to explain. The security clearance flag came through at 9:47 in the morning. A routine background refresh triggered by Margaret's Pentagon databases pinging at Cedar Creek Medical, a digital alarm that would have meant nothing to anyone else in the hospital, except to the 3 people now sitting in the administrator's conference room. The IT director didn't understand why a nurse's file suddenly routed to federal systems. The administrator understood even less. But the flag itself was unmistakable. Captain Margaret Walsh. Active clearance. Compartmentalized intelligence. Authorization level 7. By 10:15, the administrator had quietly cleared the conference room and locked the door. The first to arrive was the patient from room 4B. No longer sedated. No longer the nameless recovery statistic they'd been processing for 8 weeks. The man moved like someone reconstructing themselves from broken pieces, his arms still bandaged, his breathing still measured, but his eyes were clear and focused, and they locked directly onto Margaret the moment she entered the room. She hadn't been summoned. She'd simply been there, checking vitals, and when she saw him sitting at the conference table instead of lying in a hospital bed, something in her chest tightened. He reached out his good hand. Didn't speak at first. Just held her gaze the way soldiers do when words would cheapen the moment. Then, Red Hawk 6. You pulled my entire unit out of that compound. The room felt smaller. Margaret's breath came steady, controlled, but something flickered across her face, recognition, not of this man, but of a version of herself that lived in someone else's memory. Someone else's survival. She didn't answer. Not yet. She just nodded once, and he understood that nod meant everything. The Marine Corps colonel entered at 10:32. Silver eagles on his collar. A folder under his arm that he placed on the table with the precision of someone who understands the weight of paper. He opened it slowly, deliberately, and began to read in a voice that carried the weight of ceremony. Captain Margaret Walsh, United States Army, 10th Special Forces Group, for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy in Kandahar Province, Afghanistan, September 2019. Under intense hostile fire, Captain Walsh led for soldiers from a compromised forward operating base through an active ambush zone, sustaining a penetrating wound to her left shoulder while providing suppressive fire and medical aid to a wounded team sergeant. Her actions directly resulted in the survival of 12 personnel and the recovery of classified intelligence materials. The Silver Star is awarded for gallantry in action. He paused. Looked up from the citation. 3 combat deployments. Bronze Star with V device. 2 Purple Hearts. Each decoration read as its own sentence. Each one landing like a gavel. And the respect of every operator who ever served under your command. Margaret stood motionless. Not trembling. Not breaking. Her hands were steady at her sides. The nurse scrub she wore seemed suddenly inadequate for the woman standing in them, as if the uniform itself had been holding back something larger. The general entered at 11 o'clock. 2 stars. The kind of rank that makes rooms go quiet just from the pressure change in the air. He moved to Margaret with a deliberateness that suggested this was not a routine administrative meeting, and when he stood before her, he rendered a salute, full, formal, hand to brow, to the decoration she had never worn in public, had carried instead like scars. Then he accepted from her hands the folded flag. The one she'd kept for 2 years. The one wrapped around Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen's memory, the one whose owner had whispered a dying request into Margaret's ear to Field Hospital in Kandahar, go home. Finish what we started. Find the people hurting on their own. That flag had been her assignment. That flag had been her tether to a mission that required her to be invisible, ordinary, just a nurse checking vitals and documenting everything with surgical precision. The general held it against his chest. Didn't speak. Sometimes silence carries more authority than words. The FBI arrived at 11:45. 3 agents in dark suits that looked like uniforms, carrying briefcases and federal warrants printed on paper that moved like weapons. They requested Dr. Mercer's presence in the administrator's conference room. Margaret watched through the glass partition as they spread documents across the mahogany table like prosecutors laying out a case at trial. Her original chart notes. The altered surgical logs. Phone records showing Mercer's calls to the malpractice insurer made within minutes of her thoracotomy. Billing records highlighting the phantom cardiac procedures, equipment charges for surgeries that never occurred, pharmaceutical costs inflated by 37%, kickback arrangements with med tech supplies stretching back 14 months. The lead agent spoke with the calm of someone who had seen this pattern 100 times. Dr. Mercer, you altered hospital records. You attempted to forge termination documents for a federal intelligence officer. That's obstruction of federal records, falsification of documents, and conspiracy to obstruct an active intelligence operation. Mercer's attorney arrived within 20 minutes, but the evidence was methodical. Undeniable. A thread pulled, and his entire scheme came unraveled. Margaret's perfect documentation had been the fuse. Her precision the detonator. At 2:45 in the afternoon, the FBI walked Dr. Mercer out through the main lobby of Cedar Creek Medical. Past the nurse's station where Margaret had been mocked. Past the break room where he'd knocked her coffee from the machine and watched it shatter on the tile floor. Past the residents, Patterson and Chen, who stood frozen against the wall, their earlier smirks now erased into shock. Mercer's face was grey, his hands cuffed in front of him, his eyes fixed on the floor like a man who couldn't bear to see what he'd become. Margaret stood in the hallway as he passed. Her face composed. Her breathing steady. One measured breath. No tears. He didn't look at her. The local news crews captured the perp walk from the parking lot, and by 6 o'clock that evening the story led every channel in North Carolina. Cedar Creek chief of surgery arrested in fraud scheme, undercover Army captain's records key to investigation. Margaret's son saw it on his phone during robotics club. 3 question marks. She texted back, "Come home. I'll explain everything." 18 months later, on a Tuesday morning in October, Margaret drove past the minimum security federal facility on Westwood Drive and glimpsed something through a chain-link fence that made her press her foot slightly harder on the accelerator without conscious intention. Dr. Mercer, in a grey work-release uniform, loading boxes into a medical supply van. His hair had greyed. His shoulders had curved downward as if the weight of consequence had made itself physical. She didn't slow down. Didn't look directly at him. Some people disappear while still breathing. The cardiac wing at Cedar Creek had been renovated. New protocols. A billing department completely restructured under federal oversight. Margaret's documentation standards, the ones Mercer had called civilian incompetence, were now hospital-wide mandate. Every procedure logged. Every charge audited. Every precision of her record-keeping validated in the structure that would replace him. The folded flag rested in a glass case on the cardiac wing wall, mounted on a mahogany plaque that read, "In memory of those who serve in silence. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen, 75th Ranger Regiment." Margaret stood in her scrubs beside the green beret from Room 4B, whose real name was Colonel James Reeves, as he took his first full independent steps down the ICU hallway after 3 months of recovery and physical therapy. Her son stood on the other side, in his robotics club shirt, finally understanding why his mother kept secrets and why some battles are fought in hospitals instead of deserts. Colonel Reeves paused at the glass case. Rendered a salute. The gesture was held for exactly 2 seconds, the duration of respect across time. "Marcus would be proud, Captain," he said quietly. "He'd say I took too long. He was always impatient." Margaret's voice carried the weight of someone speaking to the dead. "Always pushing us forward." The administrator approached with reinstatement papers, full nursing privileges restored, back pay calculated to the day, formal apology printed on letterhead. But also a different offer. Director of Clinical Standards. Oversight of all documentation protocols. Authority to flag irregularities directly to federal auditors. A desk. Power. The kind of recognition that rewrites a career from erasure to prominence. Margaret considered the offer while looking at her son. At the flag. At the hallway where she'd been humiliated 2 years earlier, where Dr. Mercer had mocked her competence, where she'd stood with her composure intact while everything invisible inside her held like steel. "I'll take the nursing position," she said. "The one where I actually take care of patients." Colonel Reeves smiled then. Understood without being told. Red Hawk 6 never did like desk jobs. As they walked toward the exit, Margaret between her son and the soldier she'd saved, the flag visible behind them in its case, the hallway empty now of the weight that had filled it, her son asked quietly, "Are you going to tell me about Kandahar now?" She put her arm around his shoulders. The gesture was simple. The answer wasn't, some of it. The parts that matter. Which parts are those? She glanced back at the flag. At the empty hallway. At the hospital that had tried to break her and failed. The afternoon light came through the windows like benediction, and in that moment she understood something that no medal could teach her, no citation could capture, that the truest heroism is what you do when the world stops watching, when there's no recognition waiting, when all that remains is the choice to help someone else survive the unbearable weight they carry. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. The automatic doors opened to afternoon sunlight spreading across the parking lot. They walked through together, the captain and the colonel, the mother and the son, and somewhere in the city, a man drove a medical supply van through streets he used to own, carrying nothing but the weight of what he'd lost when he'd underestimated the quiet strength of someone he'd thought was just a nurse. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who couldn't see your true value, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. Drop a comment and tell us, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? And share this with someone who needs to remember that the quietest people in the room might just be holding it all together.